There's going to be things in your life that you don't have control over. Human beings can control a lot more than they think they can. And oftentimes it's pretty easy just to say, oh, that's not me, that's not on me. And people say that's not my fault. There's nothing I can do about that. And more often than people think, there is something you can do about it. And it is your fault. But if you have a mindset that's so highly disciplined, so highly structured, like I just said, then you're not going to think creatively when there's a problem that needs to be solved. So you want to have people that don't mind the discipline and can actually access the discipline in a way that they can utilize it, but you don't want people to be trapped by discipline. And it's the same thing in jiu-jitsu. If you have someone that only knows how to do a certain move and they can't think creatively about other ways to employ that, it's not that they're not going to be good, because they are going to be good, but they're going to reach limitations. And one of the interesting things in the SEAL teams is we didn't have, especially when I was coming up, we didn't have any doctrine whatsoever. There was no written doctrine of any kind. So everything that you learned was word of mouth. You learned from the guys that went before you, and that meant if the guys that went before you didn't really know what they were doing, you're probably learning a bad way. And if you didn't think objectively about it, then you might follow someone down a path that doesn't make any sense. So you ended up with a bunch of guys in the SEAL teams that were pretty open-minded, and they could kind of look at problems and figure out how to solve them. In the Army and the Marine Corps, they have doctrine for just about everything. This is how you do a raid. This is how you conduct an ambush. They had written doctrine for this. So if you didn't know how, you could just look at a book, which is actually a huge benefit for them. Because if I'm a new platoon commander and I don't know how to do an ambush, I can just look at this book and I can learn how to do it. And so there's some huge benefits to having a very disciplined doctrine that you can follow. But that's one of the odd advantages of the SEAL teams, is that since we didn't have any doctrine, we had to be a little bit more free thinking, and that made us a little bit more adaptive in some situations. So it's just like anything else. Your strength can be your weakness can be your strength, and you have to be aware. And if you're aware that it's a strength, and if you're aware that it can also be a weakness, and if you're aware that it's a weakness and you're aware that it can also be a strength, then you can probably optimize the way that you're going to think, which is pretty beneficial. Some people are going to have more propensity to be creative than someone else, and some people are more rigid than other people in the way they think. And you can take someone that's more rigid and you can make them more creative, but everyone's going to have some kind of a limitation. And some people might have a pretty subdued limitation of how creative they're going to get, and some people can really be trained to get a lot better at that. Hey, is it possible to take too much ownership? The answer is yes. And that is, if I'm in charge and you're working for me and I take so much ownership over a mission or over a project that you don't feel like you have any input at all, then I've taken too much ownership. As far as an individual person, there's going to be things in your life that you don't have control over. And one of the early questions that I got asked about this, like for instance, someone gets a terrible disease, and or their kids gets a terrible disease, a random disease that's through no fault of anyone. The kid gets sick or the person gets sick, and no, there's nothing you can do about that. What you can take ownership of is how you respond to that situation, and so that's what you have to do. There's things that you can control. There's things you can't control. Now, I will tell you that human beings can control a lot more than they think they can, and oftentimes it's pretty easy just to say, oh, that's not me, that's not on me. And I think that's the whole genesis of the idea of extreme ownership, is most of the time, or much of the time, people say that's not my fault, there's nothing I can do about that. And more often than people think, there is something you can do about it. And it is your fault.